Hey there. Tonight, I want to begin with a small object resting in a quiet room far from the rivers that first fed it. In a climate-controlled vault beneath a museum in Oxford, there sits a clay prism no bigger than a bottle you might place beside a candle at supper. And on its brown sides, someone pressed thousands of wedge marks into wet earth so long ago that the hand behind them has become dust. The city behind them has become dust. And even the language behind them had to be pulled back from silence piece by patient piece. That is where our story starts. Not with a crown placed on a head, not with an army marching through a gate, but with a lump of baked mud that calmly insists human authority did not begin with humans at all. If you enjoy these slow journeys into the oldest corners of history, do me a small kindness and like the video, and maybe subscribe too. It helps this little firelit corner keep glowing for people who need somewhere gentle to rest. Now settle your shoulders. Let your jaw unclench. Let the room dim around you, even if the light is still technically on and pretending to be useful. Breathe a little slower. Imagine the hush of archive air, cool and dry, the faint smell of paper, stone, and old clay. Imagine a curator lifting open a drawer with careful hands, and there, under soft museum light, this four-sided prism waits like a very patient witness. Its message is unnerving in the quietest possible way. The text does not begin with argument. It does not clear its throat. It does not try to persuade. It simply states, in the same tone one might use to record grain or sheep, that kingship descended from heaven, not grew slowly, not emerged from quarrels among chiefs, not rose from the mud of politics, descended. It is such a strange sentence, and stranger still because it is delivered with no drama. The ancient scribe sounds almost bored by it, as if everyone in the room already knew this, and the only important thing was to record where the kingship went next. Honestly, I have always found that more unsettling than any grand myth, a dramatic claim invites debate. A calm claim invites a pause. It suggests procedure. It suggests precedent. It suggests that somewhere in the oldest memory of Sumer, rulership was treated not like ambition, but like property, or office, or responsibility, something that could be handed down, assigned, transferred, witnessed. Then the names begin. Alulim of Eridu, Alalgar after him, more kings after that, city after city, reign after reign, and the numbers swell so wildly that even the modern translator has to sit back a little. Tens of thousands of years, 28,800 years, 36,000 years. More time than seems fit to place inside a human life. More time than seems fit to place inside a story that expects you to nod politely and continue. And still the text continues in its dry official rhythm. It does not laugh at itself. It does not warn you that myth is entering the room. It simply lists the rulers before the flood, 8 kings in 5 cities, as if they belong in the same ledger as the dynasties that came later, the ones whose names begin to touch firmer ground, the ones archaeology can sometimes glimpse through inscriptions, bricks, seal impressions, and temple remains. This is one of the reasons the old prism keeps bothering people. It is not theatrical enough to dismiss comfortably. It sits there in its museum hush, carrying impossible reins in an accountant's voice. If you were standing here with me, in that cool vault, you might feel the same little shiver I do. Not fear, exactly. More the feeling that comes when an old document assumes a world you no longer live in. It assumes it with such confidence that for a moment you wonder whether the misunderstanding belongs to you rather than to the text. The land that produced this object lay between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq. Wide floodplains, reed marshes, hot horizons, mud that remembered every footprint until wind or water erased it. It was here, around the 5th millennium before the Common Era, that scattered settlements thickened into something denser and stranger. Villages became cities. Temples rose on platforms above the flat earth. Irrigation channels cut deliberate silver lines through the plain. The landscape began to look not only inhabited, but organized. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and can tell at once that somebody competent has been there before you? Chairs aligned, papers stacked, dust brushed away except where it has been left on purpose. The early Sumerian world has a little of that feeling. It is not a wild improvisation. It is planned, counted, measured, watched. Water is directed. Labor is recorded. Offerings are scheduled. Fields are divided. Storage is tracked. And then, just as important, all of this begins to be written down. The first writing in Sumer was not composed for beauty. It was not a poet staring at moonlight and deciding language needed to become immortal. It was barley, sheep, rations, labor duty, numbers, lists. Little tablets that existed because memory alone was not enough for a civilization becoming too large, too layered, too administratively hungry to trust everything to recall. This matters. The people who eventually copied the King List came from a culture that wrote because writing was useful. Their earliest habit was record keeping. Their instinct, when something mattered, was to press it into clay. That practical habit gives the prism its peculiar force. When a culture of record keepers preserves a sentence like kingship descended from heaven, one has to slow down and ask what they thought they were recording. Not whether the statement is literally true in a modern sense, but what kind of truth it carried for them. Legal truth, ritual truth, foundational truth, the kind that allows a city to know who may speak in the name of order. The king in Sumer was called Lugal, literally the big man. Though the phrase feels grander in context than it does in English, he was not merely a strong fellow with good posture and a louder voice than everyone else. He oversaw irrigation, laver, building, war, taxation, and justice. Yet even then, in the oldest inscriptions, he does not quite stand alone. Behind him stands a god. Each city belonged to a deity. Eridu to Enki, lord of deep wisdom and sweet fresh water. Ur to Nanna, the moon god. Uruk to An, and later to Inanna. Nippur to Enlil, whose authority carried a kind of severe height. The city was divine property. The temple was not a symbolic house. It was the god's actual household as the people understood it. And the king ruled as steward, manager, appointed caretaker, tenant on a cosmic estate. That is the atmosphere in which the line on the prism must be heard. Kingship descended from heaven because authority did not belong originally to men. Men received it. That is the claim. Men administered it, carried it for a time, then lost it, or passed it on, or were judged unworthy of it. But they did not invent it. Some scholars, sensibly enough, treat the antediluvian portion of the list as mythology woven into later history. No one is required to believe that a king sat on a throne for 36,000 years while generations of reeds rose and rotted around him. It is debated. We cannot be sure what unit of time the earliest compilers were preserving, or whether these numbers encode dynasties, astronomical cycles, deep antiquity, or simply sacred scale. But the real mystery is not the arithmetic. It is the preservation. Why keep these names? Why keep these reigns? Why put them at the beginning of a document that otherwise behaves like dynastic memory? Because in Sumer, beginnings mattered in a legal way. If you wanted to know whether a ruler was legitimate, you traced the office backward. Where had it come from? To whom had it first been given? In which city had it rested? By what right had it moved? The King List is obsessed with this movement. Kingship is in Eridu. Then it is taken to Bad Tibira, then to Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. Then the flood sweeps over the land, and afterwards, the text says, kingship descended from heaven again. Again. That is another little word that carries enormous weight. It suggests interruption, not invention. A system broken by catastrophe, then restored. An office not newly imagined after disaster, but returned, as though someone above had reopened a file and assigned the role once more. That calm repetition, before the flood and after the flood, tells us the scribes were preserving continuity. Something existed in the first world. Something survived or was restored in the second. By the time later copies of the King List were made, the old Sumerian language itself was already becoming a learned tongue, a language of scholarship and ritual, preserved by scribes, the way Latin would later be preserved by clerics and scholars, long after ordinary people stopped speaking it in the street. Yet still they copied the lists. Still they preserved the names. Still they repeated the sentence. Someone cared enough, century after century, to keep this memory alive, and that brings us back to the clay itself. I like to imagine the first scribe who pressed those signs. The soft resistance of wet earth. The stylus tip making its wedge. The hand pausing between lines. Perhaps outside the room there was river air and temple noise and the scrape of sandals. Perhaps someone nearby was reciting older material from a damaged exemplar. Perhaps a younger apprentice was watching, trying not to blink too much, because in such rooms blinking can look suspiciously like inattention. The scribe was not writing for us. He was writing for continuity. For officials, for priests, for future readers trained to understand why the movement of kingship mattered. He was preserving the chain, and the chain began in the oldest cities, in the low gleam of floodwater and the first patient rise of temple walls, where administration and cosmology sat at the same table without awkwardness. A tax record and a hymn could live side by side, A ledger and a prayer could belong to one system. To modern minds, that division feels necessary. Practical matters over here, sacred claims over there. But in Sumer, the channel digging, grain counting, temple provisioning, and the descent of kingship were all part of one arrangement. It is tempting to smile at such confidence. To say, of course, they wrapped power in heaven. All rulers do that eventually. There is truth in that. Yet I think the Sumerians deserve a little more patience than condescension. These were people who built cities where none had stood, who learned how to command rivers without ever really mastering them, who invented writing not for vanity, but for function, who organized labor, mathematics, calendars, and legal memory in ways that still feel startlingly modern. They were not dreamy fools floating through myth. They were exacting people. And exacting people do not preserve a formula for centuries unless it serves a serious purpose. Perhaps that purpose was legitimacy. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the phrase kingship, descended from heaven, was the oldest way they knew to say that rule is too dangerous to leave to mere hunger for dominance. Or perhaps, and here is where the air turns slightly colder, they meant exactly what they said, in whatever sense they understood heaven to be. That there was once a transfer, deliberate and witnessed, from a higher order to a lower one. The old prism does not explain itself. It simply waits. It gives you the line. It gives you the names. It gives you the flood. Then it leaves you with the feeling that history in Mesopotamia did not begin with people deciding to govern. It began with something descending. And once that thought settles, the whole plain between the rivers changes shape. The ziggurats are no longer only architecture. The king is no longer only administrator. The first dynasties are no longer merely local strongmen who got lucky with grain and soldiers. They become carriers of a transferred office, men standing in a chain they did not begin. Tonight we will follow that chain backward through mud and memory, through impossible numbers and very real cities, through flood water and priestly record-keeping, through stories that may be myth, or law, or encoded inheritance, or some mixture so old it refuses to choose just one form for itself. For now, though, stay with the first image. A cool vault. A baked clay prism. Thousands of wedge marks. A sentence pressed into mud while mammoths had long vanished, while Egypt had not yet raised its pyramids, while most of the world still lay beyond the horizon of Sumerian thought. A sentence simple enough to fit on one breath and heavy enough to trouble 4,000 years. When kingship descended from heaven, from there the cities begin to rise. The land where this idea took root was not gentle, though it could look soft from a distance. Southern Mesopotamia was a place of brightness and mud, of reed marsh and floodplain, of light spreading wide across flat horizons until the whole earth seemed made of water and dust, negotiating with one another. Two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, came down from the north, carrying silt and promise and trouble. They flooded, then withdrew. They fed fields, then ruined them. They gave life only to those willing to spend extraordinary effort persuading water to behave. If you were standing there at dawn in the age before empires, before the names became famous, you would not yet see the later grandeur. You would see mud brick walls drying in heat, Men hauling baskets, women grinding grain, reeds whispering at the edges of irrigation cuts, temple platforms beginning to rise above the level ground. Not yet mountains, but already statements. We are staying here. We intend to organize the horizon. Around the 5th millennium before the Common Era, settlements in this region began drawing tighter together. Not all at once, and not with a trumpet blast. More like threads being slowly pulled into a knot. Villages expanded. Populations thickened. Storehouses grew. Shrines accumulated wealth and labor. Seasonal work became year-round administration. Then, city by city, something changed in scale. Eridu stood among the earliest of them, old enough in later memory to feel almost primeval. Would become a moonlit center of wealth and ritual. Uruk would swell to astonishing size. Its temple complexes, workshops, and neighborhoods spreading across the plain like a thought too large to fit inside a single generation. Nippur would hold immense sacred prestige. Lagash would hum with administration. These were not nations in the modern sense. They were city-states, each with its own god, its own temple economy, its own ruler, its own claim to significance. The Sumerians did not first write poetry because the moon looked lovely on canal water. I say that with affection. I enjoy poetry as much as the next person trying to avoid doing practical chores. But the earliest tablets are beautifully unromantic. Barley allotments, livestock counts, lists of workers, measures of grain, deliveries made and received, labor owed. Writing appears in Sumer not as a burst of literary self-expression, but as a response to the headache of complexity. And really, it tells you almost everything about the mind behind it. These people were not casual about survival. When fields, flocks, irrigation schedules, temple offerings, and labor obligations all begin depending on one another, memory becomes too fragile. Someone must record who owes what to whom. Someone must note which household delivered fish, which field yielded grain, which workers were assigned to a canal wall, which animals belonged to the temple, and which to the crown. Once that begins, civilization crosses a threshold. What was spoken can now be fixed. What was fixed can be audited. What can be audited can be administered on a scale that oral memory alone would struggle to sustain. Imagine a small tablet, still damp, under a scribe's hand. The room is cool compared with the glare outside. A reed stylus taps and presses. The signs are not yet beautiful in the later, almost ornamental sense. They are brisk, useful, clipped. If the account balances, the city breathes easier. If it does not, someone will be summoned, and that is never a delightful invitation in any age. Over time, this habit of fixing things in clay expanded. Economic records grew into legal records. Legal records into royal inscriptions into hymns, commemorations, omens, and lists of kings. The same medium that counted sheep could preserve theology. The same stylus that tracked grain could document cosmic authority. There is something quietly profound in that. The sacred and the practical were not separated by the Sumerian mind as neatly as we might prefer. they shared a writing desk. Each city belonged to a god in a way that was not merely symbolic. Eridu was Enki's city, tied to wisdom and the sweet waters below the earth. Belonged to Nana, the moon god, whose cycles shaped ritual and time. Uruk belonged first to the sky and then powerfully to Inanna, bright, dangerous, compelling. Nippur was tied to Enlil, whose authority carried a stern vertical force, like wind descending from a height. The god was not imagined as a private source of comfort. The god was the city's true owner. So then, what was a king? The Sumerian word lugal is often rendered as king, but literally it means big man. That sounds almost comic in English, like something a child says when identifying the tallest uncle at a family meal. Yet in context, it carried grave weight. The lugal coordinated labor, commanded defense, oversaw construction, judged disputes, managed wealth, and represented the city's order. Still, he was not sovereign in the later modern sense. He did not own the land because he was king. The land belonged to the god. The king served as steward. That distinction matters. A steward rules differently from an owner. The steward is answerable upward. He does not invent authority from himself. He receives it, holds it, and can lose it if judged incompetent or impious. In theory, at least, the office remains larger than the man. In Sumerian thought, this was not a poetic nicety. It was structural. Royal inscriptions again and again stressed that the gods looked on a ruler with favor, called him by name, gave him the kingship, entrusted him with justice. This is why the phrase from the King List is so central. Kingship descended from heaven. It fits an entire political theology into a few calm words. The office belongs to the upper realm. The city waits below. The transfer is what matters. By the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the cities of Sumer had become extraordinarily sophisticated. Canals cut through fields in deliberate geometry. Temple estates controlled land, labor, and storage on a massive scale. Artisans specialized. Traders moved timber, metals, stone, and luxury goods over astonishing distances because southern Mesopotamia itself lacked many raw resources. Mud it had in abundance. Stone and timber, much less so. This meant administration had to stretch outward. Goods moved in. Records moved with them. And with complexity came hierarchy. You can almost feel it in the surviving tablets. Some people counted. Some were counted. Some sealed jars. Some carried them. Some wrote names. Some appeared as names in a column. Civilization is very impressive from a distance. Up close, it always involves someone getting assigned to a canal repair project at an inconvenient hour. Yet Sumerian hierarchy was not nakedly explained as the triumph of the strongest. It was ordered through divine association. The ruler stood between the citizens and the god. The temple stood at the center. The city's identity was inseparable from ritual service. The king did not simply conquer and feast. He built, judged, allocated, restored, and offered. If he failed to maintain justice, canal work, offerings, and order. The whole city could interpret misfortune as evidence that the divine relationship had frayed. This makes the bureaucratic quality of the King List even more interesting. The document is repetitive in a way modern readers often find almost sleepy. In such and such city, kingship was exercised. This king ruled for so long, then the city fell, or kingship moved, and the next city received it. The rhythm is not dramatic. It is administrative, almost like a transfer ledger. I have always found that detail strangely persuasive, not because it proves the supernatural claim, but because it reveals what the scribes thought they were doing. They were tracking a movement, not merely of families, but of legitimacy itself. Multiple copies of the Sumerian King List survive, found in different sites, copied in different periods. The most complete is the famous prism in Oxford, but there are others: fragments, exemplars, versions with small differences and the same core structure. That alone tells us the tradition mattered widely enough to be recopied and studied. It was not a one-off literary curiosity. It belonged to the education of scribes, to the memory of states, to the preservation of order. And the structure of the list is deeply revealing. It does not say all kings everywhere ruled at the same time. It organizes rule as singular and transferable. Kingship is in one city. Then it moves. Then it moves again. This creates a neat line of legitimacy, far neater than real politics probably ever were. But that neatness is exactly the point. The list is not trying to capture chaos. It is trying to impose meaningful sequence on the past. It tells the story of power as lawful movement rather than messy overlap. Some scholars argue that this was ideological work, a way of imagining one legitimate kingship at a time, despite the obvious reality that many cities had rulers simultaneously. That is a strong argument. Even so, it leaves untouched the deeper question. Why this particular ideology? Why insist that rule must be singular, transferable, and divinely sourced? Why not simply celebrate victorious dynasties? Why not let military success be enough? Because military success was not enough for the Sumerian mind. Force might win a city, but legitimacy required more. It required recognition that the office had come properly to the ruler, that the god, or the divine order, or the inherited system behind the temple, had accepted the transfer. The later royal inscriptions make this beautifully clear. Kings do not say only, "I defeated my enemy." They say, "The god called me. The god loved me. The god established justice through me." They frame conquest as confirmation, not creation. If you think about daily life inside one of these cities, this makes practical sense. A city-state was not merely a military camp with walls. It was a complicated organism. Fields had to be irrigated on time. Offerings had to be made. Storehouses had to be monitored. Workers had to be allocated. Priests needed support. Builders required materials. Merchants had to trust seals and measures. None of this runs well on brute force alone. It runs on accepted systems. People must believe that commands issue from a legitimate center. Otherwise, every order becomes another quarrel. The Sumerians seem to have understood, very early and very clearly, that authority is not only possession of power, it is the capacity to make order feel rightful. That may be the real pulse behind the phrase, descended from heaven. The office must come from somewhere no single ambitious man can claim to have manufactured. Otherwise, he is just another loud person with armed friends. And history, as we all know, has no shortage of those. The temples themselves embodied this logic, rising on artificial platforms, later growing into the stepped forms we call ziggurats. They lifted the divine household above the plain. It was a visual theology. Height mattered. Elevation mattered. The god's domain looked down upon the city. Processions climbed upward. Offerings moved inward. Smoke rose. Priests descended with instruction, judgment, and schedules. Even physically, authority appeared to come from above. At night, moonlight on baked brick must have made these complexes look both permanent and fragile. Mud brick never quite lets you forget that permanence is an achievement, not a guarantee. Rain can wound it. Neglect can soften it. Time can return architecture to mound. That too feels important in Mesopotamia. Civilization there was never allowed to forget how close disorder stood. Flood, drought, salinized soil, invasion, collapse of canals. Any of these could unravel years of patient work. Clay tablets survive because clay, once fired or dried, can outlast stone in its own humble way. Stone can be broken for building. Bronze can be melted. Gold is stolen. Papyrus rots. But a clay tablet dropped into a collapsed room and buried in dust may sleep for millennia, waiting for a spade. There is something fitting in that. The most fragile-seeming medium becomes the stubborn carrier of memory. Mud remembers. So when we read the old King List, or the hymns, or the law codes, or the administrative records, we are not only reading ideas, we are touching the residue of a teaching civilization. A world where authority had to be written down, witnessed, preserved, transferred. A world where the ruler stood within a chain of obligation, stretching back to the first cities, according to the scribes, beyond them, into heaven. By the time we leave this part of the story, the cities are standing. The scribes are at work. The temples dominate the skyline. The ruler is not simply a chief, but a steward. Writing has begun as accounting, and already hints at theology. The administrative habit has met the sacred imagination, and the result is one of the oldest and most persistent claims ever written into clay. Authority is not self-made. It is received. In the next movement, that claim will grow stranger, because the Sumerians did not speak only of kings and cities. They spoke of powers that could be transferred, decrees that could be held, divine capacities that moved like cargo across water and through ritual. In other words, they thought kingship was not just an idea. They thought it was something almost tangible, something one city could lose and another receive. And once you begin to hear that, the plain between the rivers grows quieter and far more mysterious. The Sumerians had a peculiar gift for making the invisible sound procedural. That may be the best way to say it. They could take something as vast and slippery as authority and speak of it as if it were a measured substance, something one city held, another city received, something that could be bestowed, witnessed, and perhaps even mishandled. Once you notice this, the old texts stop feeling like loose mythology and begin to sound like records from a civilization that thought very hard about how power moved. The key word is kingship itself. Not the king as a man of flesh and appetite. Not the old ruler who coughed in winter and favored one son too much, but kingship as office. The Sumerian language had a way of making that distinction clear. Namlugal was not simply a person seated on a stool with a crown on his head. It was the condition of being king, the right, the office, the authority, the state of lawful rule. When the tablets say, kingship descended from heaven, they are talking about that office as if it had objective existence. It is a subtle difference, but a profound one. Men D. Offices continue. Bodies fail. Authority moves. If you were a Sumerian scribe trained from youth to think in these terms, this would have felt orderly rather than mystical. A field can be transferred. A herd can be counted. A temple can receive offerings. A steward can be appointed. Why should kingship not also be transferred? Why should it not move from one city to another if the divine order required it? The old lists say exactly that. Kingship was in Eridu. Then it was taken to Bad Tibira. Then to another city. The movement has the feeling of administration. It is not chaos. It is relocation. This is where another group of strange old words enters the room. The me. Scholars still debate how best to translate that little sound, because no single English word will sit still around it. Divine decrees, cosmic principles, sacred powers, cultural ordinances, all of these gesture toward the meaning. None quite hold it. The difficulty comes from the fact that the texts treat the me as both idea and object. They are principles, yet they can be carried. They are powers, yet they can be handed over. They are conditions of civilization, yet they behave almost like items in an inventory. One of the most famous myths in the whole Mesopotamian world turns on exactly this strangeness. Inanna, bright and daring, and never especially burdened by hesitation, goes to visit Enki in Eridu. Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water, receives her hospitably. There is feasting. There is drinking. There is the slow, warm haze of beer and confidence. Then, as the story unfolds, Enki begins giving Inanna the me, not one or two, but many of them, the powers that make civilization itself possible. Kingship, priesthood, wisdom, music, truth, craft, judgment, sexual union, lamentation, the making and unmaking of cities. The list moves with a kind of amused grandeur. It is as if the whole operating system of human society is being passed across the table one glowing item at a time, while the host is too merry to notice what he is parting with. Later, when Enki sobers and realizes what has happened, he tries to retrieve the gifts. But by then Inanna has already loaded them into the boat of heaven and is carrying them toward Uruk. The powers are on the move. They are no longer abstract virtues hovering in the air. They have become transferable holdings, things that can depart one city and enrich another. That myth is often read politically, and probably quite rightly so. It reflects the rise of Uruk at the expense of older sacred Eridu. But even if it serves a political purpose, it still reveals something essential. The Sumerians could imagine the powers of civilization moving in real and deliberate transfer. And among those powers is kingship. I have always found that deeply telling. A people does not imagine such a transfer unless it already thinks of authority as something greater than the individual ruler. In that story, kingship is not invented in Uruk. It is acquired. It comes from a prior holder. It has lineage. It can be lost, stolen, moved, or bestowed. This is not the language of accidental politics. It is the language of inherited structure. Another related concept appears in later Mesopotamian literature through the image of the Tablet of Destinies. Here again we meet a sacred object that confers lawful rule. In the old stories, the being who possesses the tablet can decree order. Fate itself seems to gather around the holder. When the tablet is stolen, the cosmos shakes with disorder. When it is restored, balance returns. The point is not merely dramatic tension. The point is legitimacy. Possession matters. Procedure matters. Rightful holding matters. Power seized wrongly destabilizes the world. Power held lawfully steadies it. Pause on that for a moment, because it carries more political sophistication than people sometimes grant the ancient world. The old Mesopotamian imagination is not simply saying power belongs to whoever can grab it. Quite the opposite. It says that power taken improperly remains disturbed, even if the thief is strong. Authority must arrive in the right way. It must descend, or be transferred, or be recognized through the proper chain. Otherwise, something in reality resists it. That helps explain why later rulers spent so much energy proving not merely that they had won, but that they had been called, chosen, approved, installed. They wanted more than obedience. They wanted lawful gravity around their rule. They wanted their reign to feel like continuation, not interruption. Some kings claimed that a god had looked upon them with favor. Some claimed they had been called by name. Some traced themselves to ancient dynasties, or to figures half-wrapped in legend. Some united royal office with priestly office through marriage or appointment. The method varied. The logic remained. One did not simply become legitimate by surviving long enough in a palace. One had to connect oneself to the old descending chain. There is something almost tender in how carefully the scribes preserved these formulas. Again and again in royal inscriptions we meet the same effort. The king says the god made his name great. The god entrusted him with justice. The god gave him the scepter. The god established him to make righteousness shine in the land. This can sound repetitive to modern ears, but repetition is often where a civilization hides its deepest convictions. They repeated it because it mattered. They repeated it because no reign could feel secure without that vertical line connecting heaven, temple, dynasty, and throne. And beneath all of this lay genealogy. Why document bloodlines so carefully if rule is nothing more than military control? Why note who fathered whom? Which daughter became high priestess? Which line claimed descent from ancient kings? Which city held the office before another? The answer seems almost obvious once you sit with the texts long enough. Because bloodlines were not merely family pride. They were conduits of legitimacy. They showed where the office had flowed. They showed who had been positioned close enough to the temples, the schools, the ritual systems, the scribal training, the inherited memory to receive what previous generations had preserved. The chosen families were not chosen in the modern, shallow sense of being glamorous. They were custodians. That is the darker and more demanding meaning. To be inside one of those lines was to inherit pressure, training, expectation, ritual, obligation, and the burden of proving that the old powers had not been entrusted in vain. A prince had to learn. A priestess had to perform. A ruler had to judge. A dynasty had to demonstrate results. The right bloodline was not a decorative ribbon. It was a vessel under scrutiny. You can almost picture the palace schools and temple rooms where this happened. Children of elite households seated cross-legged before tablets, copying signs until their wrists ached, reciting lists, memorizing old names, learning the proper forms of prayer, account, legal phrasing, land measurement, offering schedules, celestial observation. No one in that world could maintain kingship merely by having a noble grandfather and a handsome profile. The office sat in a web of competencies. To rule badly was not just embarrassing. It suggested the transfer had failed, that the office had not truly descended into capable hands. This may be why so many myths and records blur the line between wisdom and power. Enki, keeper of wisdom, is also keeper of civilizational foundations. Inanna, in receiving the me, receives not just beauty or seduction, but the architecture of ordered life. The ruler requires more than force. He requires taught intelligence. He requires stored tradition. He requires access to systems older than himself. And so the old question sharpens. What exactly descended from heaven? Was it merely a theological way of saying that political order depends on law higher than appetite? Perhaps. Was it a memory that civilization itself had been received from a previous source? Not invented all at once by whoever first baked brick in the sun. Perhaps that too. Some scholars argue the myths are symbolic. Others think they preserve veiled memory of real institutional transfers. We cannot be sure, but we can say this much. The Sumerians treated kingship as something received through chain and procedure, something attached to sacred knowledge and family continuity, something that had to be preserved, not improvised. The farther you go into these texts, the less they seem interested in celebrating mere conquest. Even the great conquerors wanted retrospective blessing. They wanted their victories folded into older continuity. They married their daughters into sacred office. They restored temples. They commissioned hymns. They rebuilt shrines and copied lists. In other words, they reached backward. They understood that grabbing the city was not enough. They had to persuade the city, the temple, the scribes, and perhaps themselves that the office had actually come to them. This is where the old stories become almost uncannily modern. Not in their imagery, of course, we no longer imagine the powers of music, kingship, and lamentations stacked into a divine boat after a feast. Though honestly, that would make certain government transitions much easier to understand. But in their underlying concern, who has rightful authority? Who trained them? What chain authorizes them? Can power stand if procedure has failed? Can order endure if legitimacy is thin? The Sumerian answer was clear and relentless. Authority without lawful descent is brittle. Wisdom without transmission is perishable. Kingship must be more than ambition wearing jewelry. By the time these ideas had circulated for centuries, the old cities had become not only centers of wealth and worship, but archives of legitimacy. Eridu held old wisdom. Uruk held powerful transfer myths. Nippur guarded supreme sacred prestige. Glowed with lunar sanctity and royal ritual. To stand in one of those temple courts at dusk, when smoke rose and the sky turned copper over the floodplain, must have been to feel surrounded by accumulated authorization. Not just gods in the abstract, but records, offices, lineages, precedents. And if you were outside that chain, if you were a soldier with a spear and a little too much confidence, you might seize a gate for an evening. But to hold a kingdom, to make your name stay written after your bones were gone, you needed the descent. You needed the recognition that what you carried had come properly to your hand. That is why the old lists linger so heavily over cities and names. Not because the scribes enjoyed monotony, though some certainly may have had a private fondness for orderly repetition. It is because the movement itself was the story. Kingship in one city, then another. Received, held, lost, restored. A current moving through human vessels, and as the lists move backward into the dimmer reaches before the flood, that current becomes stranger still, because now we are told that the first holders of kingship stood in a world older than the world we know, a world of 5 cities, 8 rulers, impossible durations, and a catastrophe waiting far off beyond the reeds. The office had descended once already. Soon the waters will rise around it. There is one more detail worth noticing before we leave this chamber of ideas. The Sumerians speak as if heaven is not merely a place above the clouds, but the source register of reality, the upper archive from which the true forms of office, craft, and order are issued downward. That may sound grand, and it is, but it is also administrative in feeling. The original file exists above. Human cities receive copies, appointments, permissions. Seen that way, kingship descending from heaven is less like a lightning bolt and more like sanctioned transfer from the oldest office to the local branch. And perhaps that is why the old clay texts remain so oddly persuasive. They do not ask us to admire power. They ask us to account for it. Before the flood, the King List gives us 8 kings. It says this with the same cool confidence it uses for everything else. 8 kings, 5 cities, a span of time so immense that the numbers stop behaving like ordinary history and begin to glow with the cold light of sacred arithmetic. Alulim in Eridu, Alalgar after him, then the kings of Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shuruppak. Their reigns stretch for tens of thousands of years, one after another. until the text reaches its brief and terrible pivot. Then the flood swept over. No flourish, no storm music, just that calm sentence, as if a clerk had closed one account and opened another. The impossible rain lengths have troubled readers for generations. Fairly so. No modern person is obliged to imagine a man sitting on a throne for 28,000 years while rivers changed their beds and temples weathered under moonlight. Some scholars read the numbers as symbolic. Some think they encode dynasties, his cycles, sacred mathematics, or old systems of reckoning now lost to us. We cannot be sure. Yet the puzzle, as so often in Mesopotamia, is not only the number itself. It is the decision to preserve the number. Someone believed these rulers belonged at the head of the record. Someone believed the memory of them was essential. And not just the memory of them, but the sequence. The first kingship in Eridu, then transfer again. 5 cities, 8 rulers, a pre-flood order. This is not random dream material. It is structured memory. Later Mesopotamian texts widen that strange horizon. In fragments of the ancient flood story preserved from Sumer, humanity is already established in cities before the Great Destruction. The gods have created people to labor, to maintain canals, to keep order, to serve the divine households. The same 5 cities appear again: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. That repetition matters. It suggests the tradition is not improvising new scenery each time. It is preserving a remembered sacred geography, the first map of civilized order before catastrophe broke it apart. In that older world, kingship is already present, not being invented, not slowly debated among village elders, but already active. The flood does not create authority. It interrupts it. This is where the story grows both darker and calmer at once. Darker, because the flood in Mesopotamian tradition is not an accidental bad season with soggy fields and a few unhappy goats. It is a deliberate divine reset. Humanity has grown too noisy, too numerous, too troublesome, or perhaps too far from the intended order. The divine assembly decides on destruction. Water, which once nourished the plain, becomes the instrument of erasure. And yet calm remains at the center of the tradition, because one figure is selected. In the Sumerian flood story, that figure is Yusudra. In later Akkadian retellings, he is called Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one, or Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The names shift. The role does not. One man is warned. One man preserves the seed of life. One man crosses from the old world into the new. And what is he in the oldest tradition? A king. This is no small detail. This means the survivor is not random. He is not simply a decent farmer who happened to keep his moral paperwork in order. He is already linked to the office that descended from heaven. He is already inside the chain. The old world is not ending with authority scattered to the flood. Authority is being carried through the waters in one chosen vessel. The image becomes even more haunting when you sit with it quietly. Somewhere in that pre-flood dusk, a king listens through a wall or receives a warning in secret, depending on the version. He is told to build. He is told to prepare. Outside, the cities are still standing. The temple smoke still rises. The canal water still glints in late light. People still go about ordinary tasks, unaware that their world is about to become memory. And this king, carrying not only his own life but the continuity of kingship, begins the work of preservation. I have always thought that is the true loneliness of the old flood stories. Not only that destruction is coming, but that continuity must be packed in silence. Seed, animals, family, craft, knowledge, the things without which rebuilding would be impossible. The chosen survivor becomes a moving archive. Some later traditions add that writings or sacred records were hidden away before the flood, buried in a city such as Sippar, so they could be recovered afterward. It is debated how early that detail is and how literally it should be read, but it fits perfectly with the larger pattern. Catastrophe is not faced with blind panic. It is faced with preservation protocol. Save the line. Save the seed. Save the knowledge. Save what must not vanish. The flood comes. In the old stories, it lasts 7 days and 7 nights, or rages with such force that even the gods grow uneasy. Wind, black water, the breaking of boundaries. The earth that once held brick and temple and measured fields becomes only surface beneath a storm. Then, after those days of unmaking, light returns. The survivor opens the vessel. He sees the changed world. He offers sacrifice. And then, in the Sumerian telling, something extraordinary happens. The survivor receives eternal life like a god. He is relocated to a place at the edge of ordinary geography, Dilmun in some versions, or a distant mouth of the rivers in others, a shining liminal place where the old world and the new almost touch but do not fully mingle. Why give immortality to the flood survivor? Why remove him from ordinary human society? The answer may be that he has become too charged with continuity to return as a normal man. He is now bridge, witness, preserved remnant. He has carried the seed of humanity and the memory of kingship through the greatest break in the world. He no longer fits comfortably inside everyday time. And still the king list remains matter of fact. After the flood had swept over, after kingship descended from heaven once more, kingship was in Kish. That line may be one of the strangest in all ancient literature. Descended again. Again means restoration. Again means the office survived in principle even if the world that held it was destroyed. Again means heaven did not improvise a new system. It reestablished an old one. The chain resumes in a new city, under new dynasties, but under the same office. The waters have not abolished kingship. They have purified the field in which it must now be received. This has enormous implications for how the Sumerians imagined chosen bloodlines. The line after the flood does not begin from ordinary ground-up social experimentation. It begins under the shadow of an earlier chain. The post-flood rulers can claim continuity because the office itself has continuity. Through Ziusudra, through divine restoration, through preserved memory, what began before catastrophe reappears afterward. Some traditions even preserve the memory of sages before the flood. The Epkalu, those strange teachers associated with antediluvian civilization. They are said to have instructed humanity in writing, law, craft, temple building, astronomy, all the arts that make settled life possible. Half fish in some descriptions, half men in others, sea-born bearers of old wisdom. However we read them, literally, symbolically, or institutionally, they reflect a consistent idea. Civilization was taught. It did not emerge from blank ignorance all at once. Knowledge had carriers. This matters because it shifts our understanding of the chosen line. The bloodlines were not only families that held scepters. They were lines through which memory, training, and legitimacy traveled. A king after the flood was not merely inheriting land. He was inheriting the claim that his house stood inside a transmission line reaching back through the survivor, through the first cities, through the first descent of kingship itself. No wonder genealogy mattered. No wonder later rulers labored to connect themselves to ancient lines, divine favors, sacred offices, and remembered names. They were not decorating themselves with fantasy. They were locating themselves inside the only framework that made authority feel lawful. If kingship had truly descended from heaven, then one had to show how it had reached your hand without being broken. The flood, then, is not only destruction, it is selection under pressure. This is the darker truth beneath the old tale. Catastrophe strips away pretense. It reveals what a civilization actually chooses to save. In the Sumerian memory, what was saved was not merely breathing bodies. It was seed, skill, sacred order, and the capacity to rule. The chosen family or chosen survivor matters because leadership itself is part of what must cross the water. There is almost a painful beauty in that old confidence. The world may drown. The cities may vanish. Mud brick may melt back into mud. Yet the office, the knowledge, the line, these can survive if preserved deliberately. If you imagine the moment after the waters recede, the scene is strangely soft. Not triumph, not drums, more like exhausted light on a washed world. Wet reeds bending, silence where cities used to murmur. A king stepping onto changed ground with memory heavier than anything he carries in his hands. Somewhere behind him lies the entire drowned age. Somewhere ahead lies Kish, Uruk, new dynasties, new temples, new arguments, new inscriptions, all of them about to begin. And the first question in that new world is not who is strongest. It is who carries the restored kingship. That question will lead us next into the strange teachers of the old world, the sages who were said to come from the sea, the keepers of craft, measure, and law, and into the bloodlines that claimed not only power, but trained inheritance, the right to preserve what the flood nearly erased. For now, though, let the waters settle. Let the 5 old cities sink slowly into mist. Let the 8 impossible kings stand for a moment at the edge of memory, solemn and distant, like mountains seen through rain. Whether they were literal rulers, encoded dynasties, or sacred ancestors in a legal imagination, the function they served is clear. They mark the first holders of an office too important to be lost. And because one chosen survivor carried that office through the great unmaking, the world after the flood did not begin empty. It began with inheritance. When later dynasties rose in places like Kish, they inherited more than a throne room and a nervous population. They inherited the burden of proving that the restored office truly rested with them. This is why post-flood kingship in the lists matters so much. Kish appears first, not only as a city, but as the first receiving point in the renewed world. The phrase is almost liturgical in its precision. After the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The city becomes a landing place for legitimacy. That landing changes everything. A ruler in the post-flood world can now claim two kinds of continuity at once. Continuity with the immediate dynasty before him, and continuity with the deeper pre-flood office that survived catastrophe. The first gives family succession. The second gives sacred antiquity. Together they produce something stronger than simple inheritance. They produce restoration. You can see why later rulers would cling to this framework so tightly. If your dynasty can present itself not as an opportunistic local success, but as the newest vessel in an office that predates the flood, then your claim rises above quarrelsome neighbors. You are not just ruling. You are continuing what the first cities once held. The old world breathes through your house. And perhaps that is why the numbers before the flood are so vast. Not because the scribes were careless, but because the antediluvian kings had to feel different from ordinary rulers. They belonged to the deep age, the time before the break, before the washing away. Their scale separates them from later men. Their duration makes them foundational, almost architectural. They do not merely reign. They bear the weight of beginnings. It is tempting to dismiss all of this as grand invention, and perhaps parts of it are. Yet even invention can reveal what a civilization most feared losing. The Sumerians feared the loss of rightful order. They feared the break in transmission between old authority and new ambition. They feared a world in which no one could prove where the office had come from. So they built memory against that fear. They wrote lists. They copied names. They fixed cities in sequence. They placed a survivor in the flood. They resumed the chain in Kish. If you listen carefully, almost every line says the same thing in a different form. This must continue. This must be carried. This must not begin from nothing. And so the pre-flood kings stand not only as distant rulers, but as guardians of continuity. Their task is to bring kingship to the edge of disaster. The survivor carries it through. The post-flood dynasties receive it again. The whole tradition is less interested in spectacle than in transfer. The hand must not open. The inheritance must not fall into the water. Soon we will meet the sages who taught the first cities how to measure, write, judge, and remember. But before they arrive, keep this image close. A line of kings disappearing into flood shadow. One chosen life, preserved. A new city waiting in the washed silence. And above all of it, the old office, still descending, still searching for hands prepared to hold it. There is a particular hush that belongs to shoreline stories. Not the open laughter of a harbor at noon. Not the slap of ropes against cedar hulls while merchants boast about cargo, but an earlier hush, the kind that seems to wait just before instruction begins. The Mesopotamian tradition places the next movement of the story beside water. Before cities fully knew themselves, before kings could point to long archives and claim they had inherited orderly rule from proper fathers, certain teachers were said to arrive from the sea. The old writers remembered them as sages. Later texts called them apkallu. Their shapes were described in ways that still make modern readers blink and lean closer. They were part man and part fish, or men wearing the skin of fish, or beings somehow at home in both the deep water of Enki and the dry administrative world of human cities. However we picture them, awkwardly or reverently, the function is remarkably steady. They taught. That is the important part. They did not conquer cities. They did not seize thrones. They emerged, instructed, and ordered. They brought knowledge that made settled life possible. Writing, counting, temple design, ritual sequence, canal management, law, agricultural timing, the measured arts that keep a city from dissolving into argument and mud. One ancient account says the first of them came from the sea by day, conversed with men, taught all useful things, and returned to the waters at night. It is one of the strangest images in all old history. A schoolmaster rising from the gulf with the dawn, offering civilization like a package of carefully wrapped tools, then slipping back under the dark water when his work was done. If you were standing there in that imagined hour, at the edge of the marshes where river breath met salt wind, the scene might feel less ridiculous than it does on paper. Ancient people often dressed real memory in sacred clothing. A teacher arriving by boat from another culture, from another center of knowledge, could easily become a teacher from the sea in the long mirror of oral tradition. Or perhaps the tradition meant exactly what it said. We cannot be sure. But again, the deeper point does not move. Civilization was remembered as transmission. That matters more than it first appears to. A society that believes its foundational arts were taught by sages will treat learning differently from a society that believes everything important can be improvised by whoever happens to be strongest this season. In the Mesopotamian imagination, wisdom precedes ordinary rulers. The king requires the sage. Authority requires instruction. Power without transmitted knowledge is merely noise dressed as command. The old lists of sages are linked to the same pre-flood cities as the first kings: Eridu, Bet-Tibira, Sippar, Shurapak. That overlap is too elegant to ignore. The kings hold office. The sages hold knowledge. One governs the city. The other teaches the skills that make the city governable at all. Together they form the earliest complete image of ordered civilization. Crown and archive, scepter and tablet, decree and measurement. You can almost see how the Sumerians imagined the beginning. A king seated in the first city, still uncertain in his office, perhaps, and beside him a figure of daunting calm who knows how to mark clay, how to map a canal, how to read the sky, how to establish offerings in proper sequence so the temple does not fall out of rhythm with the year. The people below may call the king great man, but the great man is himself receiving instruction. Someone older in wisdom is leaning over the foundation trench and saying, "No, not there. Here, the wall must face this way. The opening must take the morning light. The accounting must be marked with this sign, not that one. Store barley in this measure. Record labor this way. Wait for this star before opening the festival. Civilization begins to sound less like sudden brilliance and more like apprenticeship. After the flood, the traditions suggest the sages no longer walked so openly among men. Their work continued, but through human successors. That is a crucial shift. The old fish-cloaked teachers recede into sacred distance, and in their place rise priestly houses, scribal families, royal schools, temple women, counselors, stewards, scholars, interpreters of omens, those tireless human custodians who receive and pass on what they did not invent. The miraculous beginning becomes institution. This is where chosen bloodlines start to look less like fantasy and more like disciplined inheritance. If knowledge requires years of instruction, if proper ritual depends on exact memory, if astronomical timing cannot be guessed, if legal phrasing and measurement and land allotment all require trained minds, then not every household can carry the same burden. Some families become the keepers, not because the sky paints them with blue fire, but because they are positioned close enough to the temple, palace, and archive to learn the full sequence. They have teachers. They have tablets. They have time. They have expectation pressing on them from childhood, like a careful hand on the back of the neck. The chosen lines become educational lines. And then, in the historical world, there appears one of the clearest human faces of that transmission. A daughter. A royal daughter placed precisely where politics, priesthood, literacy, and sacred continuity meet. Her name has survived the fall of empires more gracefully than many kings. Enheduana. Her name feels almost unreal when first encountered, because it comes to us with several kinds of firstness attached to it. High priestess, royal daughter, learned woman, named author. But she was not simply a gifted individual who drifted by chance into one of history's bright openings. She was appointed into position within a very old logic. If kingship had to be legitimized, if rule required more than the noise of victory, then bloodline needed to be joined to sacred office. And that is exactly what happened. Her father, Sargon of Akkad, had built an empire through conquest. He was formidable, yes, but conquest alone was not enough to settle the soul of southern Mesopotamia. An empire needs more than soldiers. It needs recognition. It needs to touch the ancient, sacred architecture of the land it has seized. So Sargon placed his daughter in one of the highest priestly offices in the old Sumerian world, the end priestess of the moon god at There is a political brilliance to that act so sharp it almost glitters. Through her, his bloodline entered the oldest rhythms of temple authority. Through her, the conqueror's house wrapped itself around a far older sacred legitimacy. Through her, royal lineage and ritual lineage met under one roof. The daughter became a bridge. Her body, education, and office joined what conquest alone could never join. But she was more than a bridge built for others to cross. The surviving texts let us hear her, not perfectly, not without centuries of dust on the page. but clearly enough that the rune changes when her words arrive. She composed hymns. She signed them. She spoke in a voice at once ceremonial and personal, fierce and wounded and astonishingly alive. When a political rival drove her from office for a time, she did not simply vanish into the administrative silence that swallows so many ancient women. She wrote. She appealed to Inanna. She described exile, humiliation, reversal, and the hope of restoration. You know that feeling when a voice from the deep past suddenly sounds close enough to be in the room with you? Enheduana does that. The formal grandeur remains, of course, but underneath it there is a pulse of real personhood. A woman trained to speak for gods, speaking also out of injury, authority, and endurance. That is why her role matters so much for this story. She shows us what the chosen line looked like when embodied, not in abstract theory, but in an actual, educated life. She was chosen through bloodline. Yes, but bloodline was only the door. Inside that door waited training of a very high order. She had to read and write. She had to know ritual sequence. She had to understand temple estates, sacred geography, the powers of deities, the language of hymnic praise, and the political reality of representing a dynasty inside an ancient holy office. No one simply wandered into that competence. Think of the years behind such a figure. Clay tablets under lamplight. Senior instructors correcting recitation. Lists copied again and again until the signs sat in the hand like second nature. Calendrical sequences memorized. Offerings learned. Songs practiced. Sacred names fixed in the mind. The child of a royal house turned into a vessel fit to hold inherited knowledge, not because she was magically different, but because she underwent the long shaping that only a few families could sustain generation after generation. This is what the chosen bloodline really preserves. Access to formation. The title itself mattered. And priestess, wife of the god in ritual understanding, mediator between temple and court, heaven and city, archive and ceremony. Through that office, she stood at a point where knowledge was not ornamental. It had consequences. The proper hymn had to be known. The proper ritual day had to be observed. The proper relation between city and deity had to be maintained in language exact enough to hold reality together. Her temple hymns reveal something else as well. They map the sacred landscape. Temple after temple, city after city, each with its divine charge, its me, its specific place in the larger order. Reading those compositions is like watching someone inventory civilization itself. This temple holds one force. That city tends another. Here the god's presence is expressed in this way. There it is anchored differently. Together, the temples form a distributed treasury of continuity. What had once been taught by primordial sages now lives in institutional houses of memory. That may be the most important transition in the whole story. The knowledge that once stood beside the first kings in mysterious semi-divine form does not disappear. It settles into lineages, archives, priestly offices, schools, and trained families. It becomes harder, quieter, more procedural. Less sea light, more lamplight. Less revelation on a shore, more copying in a side room, while the incense smoke drifts and a senior priest clears his throat. And through that quieting, it survives. Enheduana belongs right at the center of that survival. She was a chosen daughter because she could carry the charge. Her office was not ceremonial decoration placed on a royal child to soften the harshness of empire. It was an active node in the preservation system. Through her, temple knowledge, dynastic legitimacy, literary skill, and sacred order were braided together tightly enough to hold under strain. No wonder her name endured. In stories like this, we are often tempted to look for dramatic, supernatural markers, some dazzling sign that a bloodline was selected by the gods. But the older and truer sign may have been more demanding. The sign was competence under pressure, the ability to preserve what had been handed down, the ability to speak with authority because one had actually learned the old forms deeply enough to keep them alive, the ability to stand in a house older than one's own dynasty and not break the chain. There is a kind of holiness in that, even if one strips away every literal divine claim. The holiness of not letting civilization forget itself. By her time, the flood lay far behind in the memory haze, and the first sea-born sages belonged to the luminous distance of tradition. Yet the same work continued. Someone still had to remember. Someone still had to teach. Someone still had to stand where rule met ritual and make the inheritance intelligible again for the next generation. That is what chosen meant in practice. Not luxury. Burden. Not glory first, but training first. Not mere descent, but demonstrated ability to hold, order, and transmit. When her hand, or the trained hand of a scribe at her dictation, pressed those signs into clay, the old current moved again. From first city to later temple, from pre-flood memory to imperial office, from sage to priestess, from divine claim to human discipline. The chain did not break, and because it did not break, later kings and later schools would still know how to justify a throne, how to order a calendar, how to dedicate a temple, how to speak an inherited world into continued existence. The chosen daughter had done what the old stories required of every true heir. She had taken what was given, borne its weight, and passed it forward. If you picture her now, do not picture only grandeur. Picture also the quieter things. The dust caught in a shaft of late afternoon light, the cool wall of a temple room under the palm, the faint scrape of reed on clay, the pause before a line is spoken aloud to be corrected, the private exhaustion after public ceremony, the knowledge that a whole architecture of memory leans on the steadiness of a very small number of trained human beings. That is how civilizations survive catastrophe long after the floodwaters are gone. They survive because someone learns the old signs properly. They survive because someone accepts office as obligation. They survive because a daughter in sacred robes can still carry an inheritance heavy enough to steady an empire. And after her, others would inherit not only her position, but the method itself. Royal daughters appointed to old temples, priestly houses preserving liturgy and astronomy, scribal families copying lists that no longer served immediate politics simply because forgetting them would be a deeper defeat than losing a city wall. In that way, the old choice kept being renewed. The bloodlines were chosen again and again by being willing to continue. Soon we must look even more closely at what exactly was being handed down. Wisdom itself. Training. The refusal of immortality in favor of transmission. The discipline by which knowledge survives because teachers die and therefore must teach well. For now, let the temple lamps burn low. Let the chosen daughter stand a little longer before the altar. Let the old line pass through her hands into ours, quietly, faithfully, without spectacle, exactly as the most important inheritances usually do. The old Mesopotamian imagination understood something severe about knowledge. If knowledge is precious, it cannot remain floating in the air like perfume above a feast. It must be lodged somewhere. In bodies, in habits, in tablets, in schools, in voices, in long repeating practice. And because human beings die, knowledge must be transferred before the body that holds it goes dark. This is why the story of Adapa matters so much. Adapa stands at a strange threshold. He is not quite a king, not quite an ordinary priest, not quite a demigod, though later tradition wraps him in all those lights at once. The texts present him as the wise man of Eridu, the sage formed by the god of wisdom himself, endowed with understanding beyond other men. The phrase used about him is extraordinary. He was given broad understanding. He knew the designs of the land. Yet one thing was withheld: eternal life. That division, wisdom granted, immortality denied, feels at first like cruelty. It has often been read that way. Why would a god equip a human being with such insight and then leave him under the old sentence of death? Why hand him a lamp and then insist the oil must run out? The story becomes stranger when Adapa is summoned to heaven, through obedience to the instructions given him, refuses the food and water that would have granted life without end. The gift approaches. He does not take it. He returns to earth, mortal still. It is one of the saddest and most thoughtful episodes in all ancient literature. But once you place it inside the larger pattern of transmitted civilization, another possibility appears. Perhaps immortality would have ruined the work. We like to imagine that an immortal teacher could preserve wisdom perfectly forever. No copying errors. No weak successors. Just one patient master holding the line through every dynasty. But civilizations do not only need stored knowledge. They need distributed knowledge. They need students formed in sequence. They need methods that outlive any one teacher. A mortal sage must teach. Mortality creates urgency, and urgency creates inheritance. This is the hidden logic at the heart of the Adapa tradition. Because he will die, Adapa must pass on what he knows. Because he remains among human beings, rather than joining the divine assembly permanently, he can establish a lineage of instruction. Wisdom does not vanish upward. It moves sideways and downward into students. The sage becomes not merely a keeper of knowledge, but the founder of a school. That is why later Mesopotamian kings and scholars loved invoking his name. To say one had learned the craft of Adapa was to claim participation in the oldest transmission line. Not invention, apprenticeship. You were not declaring yourself a genius who discovered reality fresh at dawn. You were declaring yourself properly taught. This is why the wisdom texts matter so much. Again and again we meet old men instructing sons, counselors teaching princes, masters training students in the fine grain of judgment. Do not speak arrogantly. Do not shift a boundary stone. Do not pervert judgment. Weigh carefully. Listen before deciding. Observe the omens correctly. Keep the account accurate. Such instructions can seem plain compared to glittering myth, yet plainness is exactly what makes them trustworthy. Civilized order is built out of procedures followed when no one is watching. A prince, then, was not prepared for rule simply by being born in a good room to the right father. He was prepared by schooling. He learned to read. He learned not only in the living language of his day, but often in older scholarly forms, preserved because the deepest archives of authority were written in them. He studied mathematics for accounting and architecture. He learned ritual formulas because kingship touched temple life at every point. He studied law because justice was not intuitive. It had to be trained. He learned music and hymnody because public ceremony required performance as well as decision. He learned diplomacy, military command, and the management of labor because irrigation, canals, and grain allotments will not arrange themselves out of respect for noble cheekbones. In other words, the chosen bloodline was not a biological miracle. It was an educational machine. This helps explain why the great rulers of Mesopotamia sometimes boasted so strangely in their inscriptions. They did not only say, "I defeated my enemies." They said, "I learned the scribal art. I know difficult calculations. I can read obscure tablets. I understand omens. I judge wisely." To a modern reader, this can feel like a king proudly waving his report card at the moon. But in context, it makes perfect sense. He is proving that he received the inheritance properly. He is showing that kingship did not merely land on his head like an accidental bird. He has been formed to carry it. Take the rulers of the the third period, Ur-Namma, Shulgi, and those who followed him. Their inscriptions and associated literature reveal a sophisticated program of legitimacy. Divine selection is claimed. Yes. Genealogy is emphasized. Yes. But they also insist on competence. Law codes. Temple restoration. Measured justice. Training. Shulgi especially presents himself as a model of cultivated kingship. Literate. Numerate. Athletic. Musically trained. Learned in administration. Wise in decision. It is almost exhausting, which is perhaps the point. Lawful kingship was tiring. It demanded range. And beneath these royal self-portraits, one can feel the schoolroom again. The repetitions. The memorization. The copied exemplars. The correction by elders. The long transition from child of a dynasty to vessel of a civilizational office. This is why knowledge as inheritance is a better phrase than blood superiority. The line is chosen because it can sustain long transmission. Think of the infrastructure required. Libraries or archive rooms, clay procurement, skilled scribes, senior instructors, regular copying, stable institutions able to preserve texts through political upheaval, economic support for students while they spend years learning matters that produce no immediate harvest. A family or house that can keep doing this over generations becomes a keeper line almost by necessity. It acquires gravity. Others look to it because it remembers what others have forgotten. When catastrophe strikes, these are the lines one tries to preserve. Seen this way, the flood stories and the post-flood restoration stories become intensely practical. Save the seed. Save the animals. Save the craftsmen. Save the records. Save the trained human carrier. The survivor is not simply lucky. He is necessary. Without preserved skill, the world after catastrophe will not know how to rebuild canals, consecrate temples, reckon months, or stabilize justice. Survival without transmission is only delayed collapse. This is also why the procedures of legitimacy became so important. If kingship is inherited knowledge as much as inherited office, then legitimacy must be demonstrated, not merely announced. A ruler must show that he can judge, restore, order, and preserve. The old inscriptions of rulers who founded or restored dynasties read like structured examinations. I was chosen by the god. I restored the temple. I established justice. I removed violence. I standardized weights. I cared for widow and orphan. I learned the arts required. In effect, they are saying, the inheritance reached me, and I have not dropped it. Ur-Nama did this in law and temple work. Shulgi did it in a more theatrical register, cataloging his accomplishments almost to excess. Later rulers did it by claiming to have mastered the wisdom of Adapa, or by connecting themselves to the old lines of Gilgamesh and earlier kings, or by placing daughters in the highest sacred offices, or by restoring old shrines with exacting care. The forms changed. The function held. Show the chain. Show the training. Show the results. Even failure, when it came, was interpreted within this same framework. If a dynasty collapsed, Mesopotamian thought did not need to abandon the system. It could say kingship had moved. The office persisted. The current descended elsewhere. Another line would now bear the weight. This saved the civilization from nihilism. It allowed catastrophe without total theological surrender. The city might fall. Kingship itself remained. Wisdom might dim in one archive. Another archive might still glow. And so the old pattern remains steady, all the way down. First, wisdom comes from beyond the ordinary individual. It must be received. Second, it must be taught because the receiver is mortal. Third, institutions and families arise to preserve the teaching. Fourth, authority belongs properly to those who can demonstrate they have inherited and applied the teaching well. This is the quiet architecture beneath all the stranger imagery. The chosen bloodline is the house where knowledge has not gone cold. The chosen ruler is the one who can prove he learned. The chosen daughter is the one who can stand in sacred office without breaking the order entrusted to her. And the teacher, the mortal sage, who refuses or loses immortality, becomes more valuable than an undying solitary figure because he creates succession. That may be the hardest lesson hidden in the old clay. Human beings often long to preserve things by freezing them. Mesopotamia, preserved by transmitting, not by keeping wisdom untouched in heaven, but by letting it move through vulnerable, trained, perishable bodies. It is a risk every generation must take anew. Teach this child. Copy this tablet. Restore this shrine. Recite this law. Correct this line. Remember this list. Trust that what has been handed down can still live if handed onward. The chain from Adapa to later scribes, from first sage to royal school, from ancient hymn to archive copy, is not glamorous at close range. It smells of damp clay and old wool. It sounds like recitation, correction, and the small cough of a tired instructor. It feels like obligation more than inspiration on many days. I suspect, yet from such stubborn repetition civilizations are made. If the Sumerians were right in any deep sense, then what descended from heaven was not only office, but method. A way of preserving order by forming human beings capable of carrying it. Some scholars argue these accounts are mythic overlays on ordinary social processes. Perhaps. But myth, when it endures, often protects process rather than obscures it. Here, the protected process is clear enough. Knowledge must be inherited through disciplined teaching. Rule must be legitimized through demonstrated competence. The line of preservation matters more than brilliance in isolation. So when later kings invoked Adapa, or claimed to know the old arts, or gathered libraries, or appointed daughters to the sacred houses, they were not merely decorating themselves with antique prestige. They were saying something more sober. We have received the inheritance. We know we are mortal. We intend to pass it on. That is why the old texts can still feel intimate despite the miles of time. They are speaking to the same anxiety every civilization faces. What if we forget how to be ordered? What if catastrophe comes and the line of teaching has grown thin? What if those who inherit titles no longer inherit discipline? What if no one chooses to carry the weight? The Mesopotamian answer was never simple optimism. It knew collapse. It knew flood, invasion, famine, dynastic ruin, the death of languages. Yet, again and again, it placed hope in transmission. Somewhere a teacher still instructs. Somewhere a student still copies. Somewhere a library still survives. Somewhere a ruler or priestess still proves worthy enough to keep the office from becoming empty decoration. That hope is almost unbearably human. And because it is human, it passes to the next question. If knowledge is inheritance, how does a civilization test whether the inheritor is legitimate? What are the procedures? What must be shown? How does a chosen line remain chosen once the old teachers are gone and only institutions, texts, and public acts remain? That is where the formal machinery of legitimacy enters fully. The laws, the restorations, the genealogies, the public proofs, the long, careful demonstrations by which a ruler showed not that he wanted power, but that he had received and could bear it. For now, though, let Adapa stand at the edge of heaven once more and turn back toward earth. Let him keep his mortality. Let him choose, or be made to choose, the harder gift. Not endless life, but transmissible wisdom. Not escape from time, but labor within time. Because of that return, someone else can be taught. Then someone else. Then another. until the old knowledge reaches tablets in distant museums and, somehow, reaches us. By the time later kings began inscribing their triumphs into clay and stone, the old question had become impossible to avoid. Who has the right to rule? Not who seized the gate first in the morning dust. Not who shouted loudest in the courtyard. Not who managed to keep a circle of armed men loyal through one nervous harvest. The older Mesopotamian answer was more demanding than that. A ruler had to be shown, almost the way a careful scribe shows his calculations. The line had to be traced. The office had to be received. The skill had to be demonstrated. The city, the temple, the law, the archive, all of them had to agree, or at least agree enough to keep the roof from caving in. This is where the procedure of legitimacy becomes almost soothing in its precision. If you stand back from it, it looks less like divine drama and more like a long administrative ritual designed to prevent chaos from dressing itself as authority. A new ruler could not simply say, "I am king." He had to say, "The god called me by name." He had to link himself to an older line, or marry into one, or place a daughter into sacred office, or restore the ancient temples, or issue a code of justice, or prove in public action that the current had truly descended to him. One proof was rarely enough. The burden of rule, like wet wool, required many shoulders. Ur-Nama understood this with elegant seriousness. He emerged in an age when old orders had cracked, when foreign domination had dimmed the prestige of Sumerian cities, when the whole land needed not merely a conqueror, but a restorer. So he did not rest content with victory. He built legitimacy the way masons build a staircase, one measured rise after another. Divine favor was claimed. Temples were repaired. Justice was proclaimed. A law code was established. Weights and measures were standardized. Widows and the poor were named as people the king must protect, which is one of those details that feels unexpectedly tender in a world of brick and bronze. A law code is not only a legal artifact, it is a public performance of memory. It says, "I know what proper order looks like. I know the inherited form of justice. I am not improvising. I have received a pattern, and I can apply it." If you were listening in one of those cities as such proclamations were read aloud, you might hear more than rules. You might hear reassurance. There is still a center. The measures still hold. The gods, or the institutions that speak in their names, still recognize sequence and boundary. Grain still belongs in the granary, not in the private pocket of a thief with a clever grin. Then came Shulgi, and with him, the procedure becomes almost dazzling in its fullness. He is one of those figures who seems to stride across the sources wearing too much sunlight. His self-presentation is vast, learned, athletic, literate. Look pious, powerful, musically trained, skilled in judgment, a runner, a warrior, a patron, a restorer, a king who wished very much for the world to know that he had not inherited a title only, but a complete education. At first glance, some of his self-praise can make a modern reader smile. One can almost hear him announcing his accomplishments, while a tired court scribe thinks, yes, Very impressive. Now please stop moving so I can finish the line. But beneath that slightly human comedy, there is a deep seriousness. Shulgi is documenting competence, because competence is part of legitimacy. A true king is not a decorative idol propped on a throne. He is a trained operator of inherited systems. That is why he says he learned the scribal arts. That is why he boasts of mathematics and music and debate. The throne did not exempt him from formation. The throne required it. It is useful to linger over that. In many societies, power tries to free itself from standards. It says, I am powerful. Therefore, I define what is proper. Mesopotamian legitimacy, at least in its ideal form, moved in the opposite direction. It said, because kingship is older than you, because it descended before your birth, because it is part of cosmic and civic order, you must submit yourself to the inherited standards before you can claim to bear it. The office disciplines the ruler, at least in theory, before the ruler can discipline the people. No wonder genealogy mattered so much. Genealogy was not only vanity, though vanity certainly enjoyed the ride. It was a way of placing a ruler inside an already meaningful stream. If one could trace descent from earlier legitimate kings, from divine favored houses, from figures like Gilgamesh, or from lines joined to ancient sacred offices, then one's own position appeared, less like a sudden act of appetite and more like continuation. Even invented genealogies tell the same truth in reverse. When a dynasty forged its ancestry, it did so because everyone understood legitimacy required continuity. A fabricated ladder is still evidence that a ladder was thought necessary. Royal marriages served the same function. A conqueror from outside the old sacred centers could not simply flatten the past and expect peace to bloom out of fear. He had to graft himself onto the older trunk. He had to enter the house of memory. This is why daughters were so crucial. Through them, dynasties entered temples. Through them, bloodline and ritual lineage touched. Through them, the rough hand of military success could be washed in the calmer water of inherited sacred authority. And then there were results. This may be the most quietly beautiful part of the whole system. However much divine rhetoric surrounded kingship, however many hymns insisted that the throne had descended from heaven, the rulers still had to show that the land functioned under them. Justice had to be visible. Temples had to stand. Canal works had to hold. Crops had to move. Administrators had to administer. The weak had to be protected, at least enough for the ideal to remain believable. The signs of order mattered. Divine appointment without practical order was like a beautifully inscribed receipt for grain that never arrived. When kings failed, the system had an answer for that too, and it is a stern one. Kingship moved. This is one of the most revealing features of the old tradition. The office survives the dynasty. If a city falls, if a ruler proves unable to hold justice, if enemies pour through the gates and the temple smoke curls upward into a sky that seems to have looked away, the civilization does not need to conclude that kingship was false from the beginning. It concludes that kingship has departed. It has descended elsewhere. The current has been rerouted. That idea preserved continuity through disaster. Imagine the comfort and the ache of it. Your city has fallen. Your king is gone. Your archives are scattered, Yet the old formula still exists. After destruction, kingship descended again. Not here, perhaps. Not to this broken court, but somewhere, to someone. The charge has passed. The institution is bruised, not dead. The line can continue even when your own segment of it ends in smoke. The laments over fallen cities are full of this double feeling. Grief, yes, real grief, but also the strange discipline of theological realism. The gods have moved the order. The old house is broken. Another house must now carry what this one failed to keep. It is harsh. It is not sentimental, but it prevents total collapse of meaning. The office remains larger than its temporary holder. This is why the procedure of legitimacy had to be so careful. The office was too important to leave in the hands of mere appetite for long. If we gather the pieces now, the shape becomes unmistakable. A legitimate ruler in the Mesopotamian understanding required several things at once: divine selection, or its accepted institutional equivalent, connection to an older legitimate line, whether by birth, marriage, adoption, or sacred office, training in the arts required for governance, public demonstration of justice, restoration, and competence, recognition by temples, archives, and educated elites who maintained the language of order. A ruler could seize power without these things, but to make that seizure endure, he had to acquire them or imitate them so closely that society could breathe again. There is something almost modern in that, and also something sadly timeless. Every civilization, if it wishes to last longer than a season of fear, must answer the same question: by what procedures do we distinguish a bearer of office from a taker of opportunity? The Sumerians and their successors answered by layering legitimacy until it became almost architectural. Bloodline, temple, text, law, competence, public works, ritual, archive, memory. A throne resting on one pillar could topple. A throne resting on many could survive weather. And yet, beneath all this formal structure, the quieter inheritance remained the true foundation. None of these procedures would mean anything if no one remembered how to perform them. A genealogy must be recorded. A law must be copied. A temple rite must be taught. A king must be educated. A daughter must be trained. Even legitimacy depends on teachers. That is why the scribes matter so much, and why their world deserves a softer, slower look before we leave this part of the story. Picture a tablet room in the late afternoon. The air is not grand. It smells of clay dust, old reed baskets, warmed brick, a little oil smoke. Light enters sideways and catches the edges of stacked tablets where lists of kings sit near hymn copies, where lexical exercises lie beside legal precedents, where astronomical notations wait patiently like tiny maps of the sky pressed into earth. A boy bends over a practice tablet. His signs are clumsy. His teacher notices. A correction is made. A line is recopied. Elsewhere, a senior scribe checks an older text against a newer copy to preserve accuracy. Elsewhere again, a royal order is drafted in the full confidence that procedure gives to language. Quiet everywhere. no heroic soundtrack. Just the soft persistence by which a civilization refuses to become amnesia. That room is part of kingship too. Without it, the ruler cannot prove descent. Without it, old treaties vanish. Without it, temple endowments become rumor. Without it, law collapses into memory's fog. The chosen lines, then, are never only those who sit highest. They include those who preserve the forms by which height is judged. This is perhaps the most unsettling and reassuring lesson the tablets offer. Authority is never entirely personal. It is scaffolded by invisible labor. A king may stand in the sun while dozens of quieter hands hold the ladder under him. The wiser kings seem to have known that. The more foolish ones probably learned it when the ladder disappeared. There is a little humor in that thought, I think. History is full of men who believed they were mountains and then discovered, rather late and with tremendous annoyance, that they were mostly paperwork. Sacred paperwork, admittedly, but paperwork all the same. Still, the ancient Mesopotamian view was not cynical. It did not reduce rule to clerical mechanism. It believed real authority was possible. It believed order, justice, and prosperity could flow when the right person, properly formed, properly confirmed, took up the office. That faith may strike us as naive, but perhaps every civilization must preserve some version of it, or else surrender itself entirely to brute force. By the end of these long traditions, one truth keeps returning. Being chosen was never only an honor. It was a test one kept taking. The king had to continue proving it. The priestess had to continue proving it. The scribal house had to continue proving it. The bloodline had to continue behaving like a vessel rather than a trophy. Once it stopped, the current moved on. And the pattern itself, documented across king lists, hymns, laws, laments, and archive copies, became one of the great inheritances of the ancient world. It taught that leadership without transmitted wisdom is brittle, that ancestry without discipline is hollow, and that institutions survive catastrophe only when people inside them take continuity more seriously than comfort. Soon we will reach the quietest and perhaps most lasting conclusion of all. The question is no longer whether ancient bloodlines were chosen in some magical sense. The deeper question is what the Sumerians were trying to preserve through that language, and what still survives now in museums, libraries, and the patient chain of teaching that brought their words across 4,000 years. For now, let the king step back from the inscription he has commissioned. Let the clay dry. Let the legal lines settle. Let the restored temple stand in evening light. Let the scribes file away another proof that legitimacy was not merely claimed, but built, checked, remembered, and handed onward to the next house that would be asked to bear it. When all the royal boasts are quiet, when the floodwaters have drained back into old memory, when the fish-cloaked sages have returned to the glow of story, when the chosen daughter has finished her hymn and the last court scribe has set down his reed, one thing remains. A small inheritance, quiet, fragile, repeated. That, more than anything else, is what the Sumerian record seems to guard. The clay tablets now sleep in museums. Oxford, Philadelphia, Chicago, London, Istanbul, Paris. Climate-controlled rooms where old mud outlives empires with an almost impolite calm. The cities that made those tablets are mostly low mounds now. Wind moves over them. Salt chews at the bricks. Reed beds come and go. The dynasties that once trembled with self-importance are gone so completely that their triumphs survive only when a careful student sounds them out from wedge marks under white electric light. And yet, the inheritance continues. There is something deeply moving in that. Not dramatic, not loud, just stubborn. A scribe in ancient Mesopotamia copies a king list because it must not disappear. A priestess preserves a hymn because the sacred order needs words. A royal school trains a child because power without formation is dangerous. A later empire, speaking another language, still copies older Sumerian compositions because it knows the old lines hold something necessary. An archaeologist lifts a prism from the earth. A curator stores it. A scholar translates it. A student reads it. A listener, perhaps lying in bed long after midnight, hears the old question again. Who carries civilization forward? The Sumerian answer, at least on the surface, was bloodline. Certain families, certain houses, certain lines entrusted with the burden of kingship, wisdom, temple office, and preserved instruction. Their texts say it again and again. Kingship descended from heaven. Wisdom was taught by beings already in possession of it. The flood survivor preserved the seed. Post-flood cities restored what had been held before. Priestly and royal families transmitted the charge through education, appointment, and memory. One can read that as mythology. Many do. One can read it as encoded philosophy. Many do. One can read it as imperfect historical memory of catastrophe and restoration. Some do. Each reading catches a different light. If we read it as myth, we still have to explain why the myth is so administrative, so procedural, so concerned with transfer, lineage, archive, competence, and the measurable burdens of office. Myth usually likes thunder. These texts often prefer ledgers. If we read it as pure allegory, we still have to explain why the allegory keeps returning to specific cities, specific names, exact offices, exact sequences, exact gestures of bestowal and recognition. It is a strangely clerical kind of symbolism. If we read it as history, with theological clothing wrapped around it, we gain one compelling possibility. The ancients may have been remembering not gods descending through literal sky, but the arrival and preservation of organized knowledge to people standing inside the first cities. That might have felt heavenly enough. Honestly, I think that is where the story becomes gentlest and strongest at the same time. What if chosen bloodline meant, in practice, not superior flesh, but preserved access? Access to archives, access to training, access to old teachers, access to the disciplines that let law outlive force and memory outlive death, access to the slow transmission of what must not be forgotten if the city is to keep breathing. A child raised inside such a line would inherit not magic, but proximity. He would hear old names at the table, She would see tablets before she understood them. He would be corrected early. She would memorize hymns before others even knew which god held which city. He would watch disputes judged according to inherited procedure. She would learn how sacred office binds the human world to ordered time. None of this is glamorous. It is formative, and because it is formative, it looks to outsiders like destiny. Perhaps that is the hidden softness beneath all the stern old claims. The chosen are the trained. The anointed are the instructed. The bloodline matters because childhood matters. Repetition matters. Example matters. Civilization depends on what can be passed hand to hand before one generation goes dark. The old Mesopotamians understood catastrophe too well to be casual about this. Flood, invasion, famine, dynastic collapse, the death of languages. Temples burned, cities emptied, roads cut, archives scattered. They knew how quickly a world can thin out. So they built preservation into kinship, office, and ritual. They stored memory in families, because families, for all their flaws, are among the oldest vessels humans have. They stored it in temples, because temples outlast rulers. They stored it in scribal schools because instruction is stronger than inspiration when centuries are involved. That is why the inheritance survived, even after Sumer itself vanished. Long after the language died in common speech, scholars still copied Sumerian texts. Think about that for a moment. A dead language, preserved because it carried authority. Later civilizations, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, treated the old compositions not as useless relics, but as necessary foundations. They made lexical lists. They taught students how to read what no child spoke at home anymore. They preserved the old king lists, hymns, and wisdom texts because the chain could not simply be snapped without consequence. There is a lovely irony in this. The chosen bloodline, in the broadest sense, eventually became larger than blood. It became pedagogical. Anyone admitted into the long work of learning, copying, preserving, and transmitting entered the line of inheritance. Not by birth alone, but by discipline. The old divine language softened into human responsibility. That may be the quietest revelation in the whole story. The Sumerian explanation begins with heaven, but its survival depends on human choice. Someone had to keep copying. Someone had to keep teaching. Someone had to keep caring whether the signs were right. Someone had to decide that preserving a law code, a hymn, a royal genealogy, or a flood narrative mattered more than taking the easier road of forgetfulness. That someone was the real chosen one every time. Not because a god thundered a name from a cloud, though the ancients might have said exactly that, but because in the ordinary fatigue of history, some people accepted responsibility instead of letting the line fail. They remembered what needed remembering. They transmitted what needed transmitting. They bore the weight. And the weight is real. You can feel it in the old texts when they speak of justice. Not sentimental justice, but procedural justice. The widow should not be crushed. The poor should not be cheated. The measure should be fair. The canal should be maintained. The temple should not be plundered. The ruler should listen. The counselor should advise honestly. The student should learn deeply. These are the beams inside the roof. Remove enough of them, and the whole house gives way. The Sumerians feared that collapse enough to make preservation sacred. That is worth sitting with in the dim hour. They did not trust civilization to continue automatically. They knew better. They had watched cities rise and fall. They had seen dynasties boast and then vanish into the kind of silence that makes even their names feel dusty in the mouth. So they wrapped transmission in the highest language they had. They said it descended from heaven. They said the sages came from the sea. They said the flood survivor preserved the seed. They said kingship moved from city to city under divine will. Whether one takes these claims literally or not, one can still feel the underlying urgency. Do not let the inheritance die. And here, perhaps, the story turns gently toward us. We like to believe we are modern enough to have escaped such old structures. We tell ourselves knowledge lives in systems now, not lineages. In institutions, not chosen houses. But look more closely. Every discipline still depends on apprenticeship. Every serious craft still survives because someone teaches the next person carefully. Every archive still needs custodians. Every language, every law, every tradition, every scientific method, every humane standard still relies on chains of preservation. Universities are only another version of the old schoolroom. Libraries are only another version of the tablet house. Professional lineages, scholarly traditions, family teachings, civic memory, they are all updated forms of the same deep problem. How do we keep what matters from being washed away? The answer is still by choosing carriers. Not always by birth now. Sometimes by vocation. Sometimes by discipline. Sometimes by love of the thing itself. But always by choosing. Someone has to step forward and say, I will learn this properly. I will keep this safe. I will pass this on. I will not let the line end with me. That, I suspect, is why the old Sumerian materials continue to feel so haunting. They are not only describing ancient kings, they are describing a permanent human task. Carry the inheritance. Carry it through flood. Carry it through conquest. Carry it through the death of the old language. Carry it through the collapse of prestige. Carry it through the long, dull centuries when no one seems to care. Carry it until someone else is ready to receive it. The clay tablets did exactly that. They carried. Quietly. Stubbornly. Without needing our belief to remain what they are. A prism in Oxford still says kingship descended from heaven. A hymn still preserves the voice of Enheduana. A flood story still remembers a chosen survivor. A wisdom text still advises a son. A royal inscription still insists that justice, not appetite, marks the real ruler. Fired mud has outlasted armies. There is a humble comedy in that too. So much straining for greatness. And in the end, what survives is often a stack of baked accounting clay and a few lines copied by a diligent student with sore fingers. History can be wonderfully rude to vanity. Still, vanity is not the final note here. Continuity is. The inheritance made it. Not fully. Never fully. Much is gone forever. Whole libraries vanished. Whole schools broke. Whole chants fell silent before anyone could save them. We should be honest about that. But enough remained. Enough crossed the river. Enough came through the fire. Enough lay buried until later hands lifted it again. Enough, in other words, to prove the system worked often enough to matter. The bloodlines endured because the function endured. The function endured because some people accepted discipline. The discipline endured because memory was treated as sacred work. And because of that, we can still listen. Now the room grows quieter. The museum vaults dim. The old cities flatten into moonlit mounds. The temple daughter steps back from the altar. The king sets down his seal. The sage closes his lesson tablet. The flood survivor rests at the edge of first light. The sea-born teacher disappears below the dark water. The student in the scribal room wipes damp clay from his thumb and begins the line again. This is the inheritance. Not certainty, perhaps. Not proof in the modern way. Not a neat answer pinned under glass. But a chain. A method. A burden carried. A memory deliberately preserved. And maybe that is enough for tonight. Maybe it is enough to know that civilization was never self-sustaining. Not in Sumer. Not now. It has always depended on chosen carriers. On those willing to receive, preserve, and transmit. On those who understand that what is not taught disappears. On those who keep copying the signs after everyone else has gone home. The Sumerians said kingship descended from heaven. We do not have to use the same words to hear the wisdom underneath them. Some forms of order do come from beyond the isolated self. They come through inheritance, through schooling, through fidelity to what older hands have passed down. They arrive already shaped by other minds, other lives, other generations. They descend, if you like, through memory. And so the question the old tablets leave with us is both ancient and immediate. Will someone carry it next? Will someone keep the law, the language, the measured arts, the careful justice, the disciplined memory? Will someone teach? Will someone learn? Will someone accept the burden that makes continuity possible? Generation after generation, someone has. That is why the line still breathes. That is why the tablets still speak. That is why the inheritance, though quiet, has not ended. Let the final thought settle the way dust settles on old brick after the heat has gone from the day. Nothing we know is guaranteed to survive by accident. It survives because someone, somewhere, chooses not to let it die. The ancients dressed that truth in the language of heaven. We may dress it in the language of archives, schools, and responsibility. Either way, the work is the same. The inheritance waits. The next hands receive it. The line continues. Good night.